All right.
Okay. So, hi everyone. My name's Arman Cole. I'm a filmmaker and freelance producer. My short film Small Arms is online right now at the Omeletto YouTube channel. You can check that out. It stars Tyler Young. And right now we're kind of celebrating because it's getting pretty close to 2 million views on there. So I'm really excited about that. I also co-produced the Warner Brothers financed science fiction short film Rise, which is a little bit like a trailer for a film that'll hopefully get made eventually. And you can check out Rise on Vimeo. That's directed by David Karlak. Right now, I am working on a lot of different things, none of which are thrillers, unfortunately, but we'll get into that shortly. So let's see here. I'm going to start this out with just a discussion of genre and what genre is. Now, I'm a graduate of the USC MFA film program, and for whatever reason in that program, genre never came up. So this is something that I did a lot of independent research on after school and got really into. There's a whole universe of academic genre theory that goes beyond film. Some of you might be familiar with some of it. It gets very technical and very complicated and very highfalutin. So I won't bore you too much with theory, but I will just kind of get into the basics here. So genre is, in general, just kind of a way that we talk about and categorize texts. A text in an academic sense could be a film, it could be a novel, it even could be a video game. Text doesn't necessarily mean it's actually words on a page. The word genre comes from French. It means kind. And according to Merriam-Webster, genre is a category of artistic, musical, literary composition characterized by a particular style, form, or content. Okay, it's a pretty vague definition. There's a lot of debate about what constitutes a genre. There's a theorist named Daniel Chandler who says that one theorist's genre may be another subgenre. It's a very messy territory, but there are some formal categorizations that are useful when thinking about film and literature, and especially if you're a writer and you're trying to create your own genre of fiction. So I'll start out with the kind of original three genres here, which were the epic, the tragedy, and the comedy. Those are the, you may remember this from school. Aristotle wrote about the differences between tragedy and comedy. These definitions are a little bit alien to us now because comedy basically meant a work that didn't end in tragedy. There was a lot of ancient Greek theory about drama that I won't get into, but epics were pretty much universal throughout the ancient world and usually involved some kind of quasi-religious element, demigods, mythical creatures, etc. If you've read the Odyssey or the Iliad, you'd be familiar with this, or Gilgamesh. Modern fiction genres that have evolved since the advent of capitalism are obviously much more numerous and totally different. This is a quote from a theorist named Dennis McQuail, who passed away a few years ago, but he writes that, yeah, the genre may be considered as a practical device for helping any mass medium to produce consistently and efficiently and relate its production to the expectations of its customers. So expectations is the operative word here. Over time, audiences start to learn certain motifs or cliches from specific types of fiction. Those motifs are kind of categorized into genres, which then become effectively a marketing term. You have fans of a specific genre that emerge, and publishers and film studios start to market to that demographic. So genre is very much wrapped up in our economic system and post-war consumerism, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, very different than ancient Greek genres. Some common genres you might be familiar with are on this slide. And most of the modern genres that we are familiar with are products of the 19th century, actually. So relatively recent. I'll get into it a little bit more later. But, for instance, even fantasy, you might say, well, fantasy isn't the Odyssey kind of a fantasy? Well, not really, in the sense that we think about contemporary fantasy like Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings. There are certain genre expectations, audience expectations. Fantasy novels of the 19th century sort of operated with the understanding that the audience reading the work would know that, for instance, ghosts aren't actually real, or they'd at least know that this isn't supposed to be some sort of depiction of reality or theological work like a lot of epics were. Suspense is its own type of fiction, and I'm going to get into this as well, but suspense, you could say suspense is a feature of ancient epics as well. Naturally, you're kind of worried about Odysseus when he's running into a Cyclops. That doesn't mean that the Odyssey is a suspense poem or novel or whatever you want to call it. It is an epic, and there are expectations that go along with contemporary genres. We know what we're looking for. Somebody who wants to watch a Western wants to see a tale of revenge. They want to see certain subject matter, et cetera, et cetera. But subject matter is only one variable. So, a film isn't a Western just because it's about cowboys and it's set in Arizona. Genre theorists have pointed this out. It's a very weak criterion for generic grouping, according to Robert Stam. And that's pretty obvious, I think, because if you were to write a let's say a horror movie set in West Texas, that doesn't make it a Western. So another point to make here is that genres are constantly changing to suit the tastes of the public in a particular moment. The theorist Steve Neal pointed out that genres are almost always historically relative and historically specific, and that's an important concept because it means that there's no ideal type of genre. There's no ideal floating in space of what a Western is. It can kind of morph over time. The theorist Amy Davitt famously stated that culture defines what situations and genres are likely or possible. And so there's a dialogue between consumers and the genre itself, and also our society at large, and how social and political and economic conditions can change genre expectations over time. But naturally, as I said earlier, it's not objective. There isn't some rule book that clearly defines the differences. Let's move on here to the thriller, which is what this webinar is about. Thriller is a really problematic genre. And I'm going to get into this a little bit more as we go on. But as you can see, the Merriam-Webster definition of a thriller is maybe a little bit unsatisfying. So it's a work of fiction or drama designed to hold the interest by the use of a high degree of intrigue, adventure, or suspense. Now, here's where I take issue with that, which is almost every genre, every type of genre fiction utilizes suspense as a narrative device to some extent. You're going to find suspense, obviously, in horror, and that's a really big sticking point. You're going to find suspense in even in literary fiction. You have suspense. You have anxiety about things that are going to happen in a Tolstoy or Dostoevsky novel. So then what does it actually mean? The kind of academic genre theorists often just avoid talking about thrillers entirely. Critic Barry Grant argues it's the term that's more appropriately used to describe tone, and it's too vague of a generic category to even really talk about. So there's this question of whether or not it even constitutes a genre. There's another critic, Virginia Aguado, which is an academic in Spain, who said that the most characteristic feature of the thriller would seem to be the psychological effect of unremitting, relentless suspense on the audience. And that is more about iconography. It's not really plot or formal structure. Okay. So I'm going to present to you my own unique independent thesis in this webinar that I haven't seen elsewhere, although someone has probably suggested something similar, that the thriller actually does have formal components that are relatively consistent and appear in films that we would describe as thrillers going back to the 1930s. So here's my pitch to you, and I'm sure there are holes that can be poked in it. But in general, a thriller features a protagonist or protagonists who is or are thrust into a situation that either is dangerous or that they perceive to be dangerous. And a thriller features a plot driven forward by attempts of the protagonist to gather information and unveil the truth. In doing so, the protagonists expose themselves to continual danger. So this is, in my view, what makes a thriller closely related to a mystery. A lot of people will categorize thrillers as being closer in nature to action-adventure films or action-adventure fiction, or even horror. I would say, and we're going to get into the history of the thriller and how it's emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries, but I would say that it seems to have emerged out of mystery and detective fiction, with influences from other genres like horror and gothic fiction and adventure. But nevertheless, this kind of core question of what is the truth, in my view, is what makes a thriller a thriller. And I will openly admit that this definition throws out a lot of films that are commonly thought of as thrillers, but I'll make my case to you, and you can make up your mind by yourself. So we already talked about this, but yes, virtually every genre going back to antiquity contains some degree of suspense, which is why genre theorists kind of refuse to even talk about it. But let's get into the history. Yes, Pulp Fiction. As I said earlier, the thriller genre really emerged out of a sort of a movement of detective and mystery novels that were written for mostly working class audiences in the late 19th century. There were the penny dreadfuls, these kinds of really pulp throwaway novels. There is a literary precedent for mysteries with Edgar Allan Poe. Murders in the Rue Morgue is often cited by mystery writers as a major influence. The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins, another example. Again, though, this is really a 19th century phenomenon. The mystery emerges in the 19th century, and detective fiction and the antecedents to police procedurals emerge in this era as well. You might wonder why, and some speculate that it's because police forces were professionalized in that era. Prior to the professional police force, crimes were solved kind of locally, or, you know, in going back to antiquity, actually, families would work out a lot of issues that we now work out in the criminal justice system. They'd work it out informally between each other, settle, you know, make settlements, etc. The police force is a modern phenomenon. Professionalized police really became a major force in European society, French and British society especially, in the kind of middle of the 19th century. And so the popularity of detective fiction and mystery fiction sort of comes out of that Victorian interest in criminal justice as a result of a professionalized police force. I'm going to backtrack a little bit here, but we can run through sort of the trajectory, the literary genealogy of the thriller in fiction. And this is not cinema, but you know, 1887, Arthur Conan Doyle unveils Sherlock Holmes. That's a real touchstone moment for the detective genre, and Sherlock Holmes became really influential on the subsequent generation of mystery writers, which included Agatha Christie. And then adventure novels became really popular. Jules Verne, Alexander Dumas. Gothic and early horror fiction also crystallized again, and a lot of this was happening in these kind of sensationalistic pulp magazines and sort of you know, magazine stand throwaway novels. You know, all of these genres became really influential on cinema in the early 20th century, and all sort of eventually crystallized into various genres such as horror. Which also has its origins in adventure novels. But spy fiction came a little bit later, around 1901. A major touchstone work was The Riddle of the Sands by an Irish author named Erskine Childer. Interestingly, that work was later adapted into a film in the 1970s that was a British thriller, but yes, it was about uncovering a conspiracy of the Kaiser in Germany to invade Great Britain. So, actually, interestingly, in form, it has a lot in common with later political thrillers and spy thrillers. Conrad and Kipling also contributed to the emergence of the spy fiction in that era, and diamond pulp novels continued in popularity. Then you get into the 20s and 30s, and that was really the golden age of detective fiction, and a closely related genre to the thriller is film noir in film studies. And film noir really emerged out of this 20s and 30s tradition of detective fiction. You had Edward Stratemeyer and you know, the creation of Nancy Drew, the Hardy Boys, etc. Agatha Christie, who's still, I believe, the best-selling author of all time, became a big sensation in in the 1920s. Her Hercule Poirot detective novels are, still beloved to this day. And then you also had in the United States, across the pond, you had Dashiell Hammett, who invented hard-boiled fiction, which has been defined as a genre that sort of, it deals with criminal activity in a decaying urban environment. It's sort of, the flip side of Kafka, right? It's alienation and loneliness in the modern world, and with a healthy dose of nihilism in there. And Dashiell Hammett sort of solidified the existential detective that would become so important to 1940s classic Hollywood film noirs. And then also you had Raymond Chandler emerge in that era, who also would become a major cinematic influence, and wrote detective novels that would be adapted into film noirs. So let's see here. Yeah, and then after World War II, you had the development of the police procedural, which we are now familiar with as TV shows like Law and Order and things like that. A little bit less nihilistic than hard-boiled fiction and film noir. You had the kind of crystallization of the spy genre with the creation of James Bond in 1953. And then you had John le Carré in the UK, who was a former MI6 operative who emerged as a major spy novelist and fiction writer in the 60s. And John le Carré is still being adapted into Hollywood movies to this day. So a lot of this stuff is still totally relevant. And writers from the 1950s and 60s are still exerting their long influence over the 20th century. And then, I'll get into this a little bit more later, but in the post-Cold War era, you had the kind of the death of the spy novel, at least temporarily, and the rise of techno thrillers like Michael Crichton and Jurassic Park, and then more recently Dan Brown, Vince Flynn, Stieg Larsson, some names you're probably more familiar with. The thriller recently has I think become synonymous with the spy thriller or the horror thriller. Those seem to be some of the most popular subgenres of thrillers. And I'll get into thriller subgenres later in the lecture. But yes, going back to the golden age of detective fiction, Agatha Christie became sort of synonymous with mystery, and to an extent still is. Much more lighthearted than her American counterparts in Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler, but still dealing with some dark themes. In terms of cinema in this era, you had the silent film The Lodger, which was directed by Alfred Hitchcock in 1927. It's a silent film, but it came out the same year as the first sound pictures. And The Lodger is really cool because it kind of has the structure of a contemporary thriller, even though it's silent. It deals with a family beginning to suspect that their new renter is a serial killer. Okay, so Fritz Lang also became a major figure in the spy thriller genre of this era with his film Spy. And you might think that I'm not sure how many cinephiles we have in here, but going back to watch some of these really old films is pretty is much more entertaining than you might think, especially because you realize how there's nothing new under the sun and so many things have already been done. Fritz Lang, for those of you who aren't familiar, and I hope all of you are familiar, but he was a German master director who was also influential on the science fiction development of the science fiction genre with Metropolis. He planted a lot of seeds that would become film genres unto themselves. M is a sound picture that he directed that in this era that is sort of the prototypical manhunt serial killer thriller. It's a masterpiece, and if you're into films like Silence of the Lambs or Zodiac, you have to watch it. It's a pretty much essential viewing. Alfred Hitchcock is synonymous with the thriller, and his films, which he was directing around the time that Dashiell Hammett and Agatha Christie were kind of reaching their zenith as writers, continued to develop the cinematic language that we associate with suspense films. Now, I should point out that my thesis about the thriller and the importance of the concept of truth in a thriller is pretty much holds for all of his early period films, or most of his early period films. And we'll talk a little bit more about his about North by Northwest and Strangers on a Train once we get to the 50s. But Alfred Hitchcock films often feature a protagonist that is thrust into a situation that seems to be out of his or her control, and either has to clear his or her name or discover the truth somehow. The truth is really the operative word in Hitchcock film. In Psycho, who killed Marianne? Why? What is the motivation? This is categorically different than an action film or a monster movie, and I will expand on that as we continue. But we're going to get into the 1940s here, which is the classical period of film noir. You had films like Double Indemnity, which also concerned the question of the truth. You had The Big Sleep, The Maltese Falcon, Key Largo. And I would argue that most of these films could be considered thrillers. To this day, thrillers make reference to this classical era. Especially films like The Foreign Correspondent, which could be categorized as a spy thriller, The Man Who Knew Too Much, another Hitchcock, and The Third Man, which is really one of my favorite films of all time. But The Third Man, structurally speaking, is a lot like contemporary thrillers. It's one of these films that just kind of casts a long shadow over the entire genre, and films, like The Bourne Identity, owe a lot to Carol Reed's masterpiece. It's about a character named Holly Martins who arrives in post-war Vienna to find his friend Harry Lime has gone missing, and he begins to suspect a conspiracy. So it has everything that you'd associate with a thriller today. It's got political intrigue. It's got a commentary on human nature. It's got a ton of suspense and action, and even a denouement that takes place in a cave or a catacomb under Vienna that has been referenced again and again and again to the point where it's basically cliche. Third Man is a really great touchstone film for any thriller lovers out there. Naturally, North by Northwest, also in the same vein, a spy thriller that does have some political undertones. Not to say that thrillers have to, but as you get into the Cold War era, the spy film sort of comes into maturity. Going back to this diagram here, remember that the Cold War really became a major. It was on the minds of Americans and Western Europeans almost all of the time after the middle 50s, and that's when you start to see the crystallization of the spy thriller and spy fiction in general. So I would also like to make a distinction between spy fiction and spy thrillers. Spy fiction is simply any fiction that, or dramatic fiction that deals with spies or spy intrigue, international geopolitical intrigue. There could be spy. There were spy comedies. Going back to this question of subject matter versus formal structure, just because it's a spy film doesn't mean that it is a thriller. One of my favorite films, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold with Richard Burton, which was a major influential spy picture, I would argue was not actually a spy thriller. It was about intrigue, romance, and political questions of the Cold War. There was a moral ambiguity that was posed between the Soviet Union, United States, the Soviet Union and Western Europe, or MI6, it's got a lot of intrigue and suspense. But I don't think it's a thriller, at least not by the sort of Hitchcockian classic strangers on a train sort of notion. Moving forward into the 60s, classic spy films, The Ipcress File with a young, sexy Michael Caine. It's actually kind of funny because I had no idea that Michael Caine was never like a million years old until I watched this movie. The Ipcress File is a thriller, and it's about and it's kind of a techno thriller actually, because it concerns technology. It's about uncovering a Eastern Bloc war technology, and concerns principally these questions of what do they have and what are they going to do with it. 1967, you saw the adaptation of Ian Fleming's Casino Royale, kicking off the James Bond franchise, one of the most successful franchises in history. I would argue, going back to this question of spy fiction versus spy thrillers, that James Bond films are not actually thrillers. Usually, there's a kind of a well-established villain that has some capacity for either destroying the world or a supervillain, if you will, who is almost a sort of comically evil, much more like an action film, a contemporary action film. I would put the James Bond films more on the kind of Mission Impossible action, sort of kinetic action film axis. There isn't a lot to be discovered in a James Bond film. I mean, yeah, you have to. It turns out that they have some big weapon that they're going to use, or this person's a double agent, etc. But it's not the same thing as Jean Le Carré, where the entire question is, who's the mole? How do we find them? Who's, the paranoia, the suspicion, the gathering of information, talking to people, this is one of the reasons that I kind of attribute thrillers to, or that I argue that thrillers emerged out of the mystery genre, is that the gathering of information, shedding light on the truth is a kind of core component. No film embodies that better than the Greek thriller by director Kostagavras Z, which is the prototypical political thriller. And it's a hell of a movie. It's about the assassination of a pacifist college professor in Greece. It's based on a true story. And there's a subsequent cover-up and investigation to try to figure out what actually happened to this professor. There's a vast conspiracy. So great movie, and Hitchcocky in a lot of ways. It uses suspense really well, and was hugely influential on later thrillers that we're more familiar with. Watch it if you can. Big influence on Alan Pakula, who is kind of a latter-day American Costa Gavras in a way. Pakula's movies include Clue, All the President's Men, The Parallax View, and he has been cited again and again as kind of the granddaddy of the American spy and political thriller. From the 70s, the same era, we've got 3 Days of the Condor, and that is another outstanding political thriller that involves a vast conspiracy. I don't want to spoil it. Robert Redford, Faye Dunaway, it's amazing. And, you know, I'm not going to just list off films to you for the rest of the webinar, but I think it's important to take a look at some of these classic thrillers to see the genealogy of the genre. But I do think that at least cinematically, you kind of see this branching where the spy thriller sort of takes, and the spy / political thriller, because I think they're very closely related, kind of take their own route, whereas the sort of the crime gangster thriller branches off into its own, you know, sort of series of neo-noir films. You have Le Samurai, the French gangster thriller. It is also, I think, a true thriller because it's a question of what is going on, who is trying to kill the protagonist. So French Connection, I don't actually think it's a real thriller for the same reasons that I don't think James Bond is a real thriller. Okay, so I'm going to skip through here a little bit. It's Brian De Palma. That's Basic Instinct, which is, in my view, definitely a true thriller. And by the 80s, you have the emergence of the techno thriller with Hunt for Red October. The question, again, very much like the Ipcris file, what do the Soviets have? What kind of technology they're using? How do we stop it? 1995, Seven. Is there a more influential thriller in cinema history? I'm not sure. If you watch it, pretty much shot for shot, it could have been shot yesterday, even though it's getting to be over. I mean, I guess it's two decades old. It is a consummate neo-noir that I think Dashiell Hammett would approve of, and has all of the kind of existential angst and nihilism of that old school hard-boiled detective fiction with the influence of horror. Somebody says, I don't think De Palma did Basic Instinct. Sorry, I didn't mean to say that that De Palma did not do Basic Instinct. It was Paul Verhoeven who did Basic Instinct. No, De Palma did a few movies that maybe you could consider thrillers in the 70s. I'm not going to get into that too much. I'm only bringing up, Basic Instinct because it is a kind of it is a neo-noir thriller. It has a lot of the kind of this old school hard-boiled detective story genre tropes. Let's see here. I'm just trying to skip through here to the Bourne Identity because this is a big one and is, I think, for a lot of people, at least for millennials, for people who were born in '80s, The Bourne Identity kind of is the thriller, in the same way that Third Man was a defining thriller, or North by Northwest was a defining thriller in previous generations. The Bourne Identity, I think, is a great piece to look at as a sort of a guidepost, because it very fundamentally asks the question of what is the truth. The protagonist is thrust into this situation totally out of his control, very much like an Alfred Hitchcock movie, and needs to not only figure out what's going on, what the conspiracy is, but who he is. And I think for that reason, it works on so many different levels. Kind of a similar film of the same era was Memento. What is the truth? What's going on? I think a lot of you are probably familiar with Traffic, the drug war movie that I think may or may not be, technically speaking, a thriller, but obviously uses suspense to a great degree. Fincher's films, for the most part, like Panic Room, are true thrillers, and Denis Villeneuve more recently, definitely Prisoners, an absolutely outstanding thriller. Tinker Tailor, Soldier Spy, a film that came out a few years ago. Jean le Carré. I mean, this is a film that was based on 1960s and 70s source material. So I think understanding that kind of literary heritage of the genre is really important. And then I'm going to blitz forward here to Get Out, more recently, which a lot of people are saying is kind of constitutes a new genre of thriller entirely. And Jordan Peele actually argues that it's part of a lineage of social thrillers. Film theorists kind of differ. I'm sure the annals of genre theory will be written with all sorts of spicy takes about what exactly Get Out is. But is it, it's a social thriller, it's a horror thriller. It's a really important movie in any case, because it represents this most recent mutation of the thriller genre, based on changing social, economic, and political circumstances. That's what genre theory is all about. It's about analyzing, how society affects the development of genre expectations. Okay, there you go. There's a lot of thriller titles I just blitzed through. You have a lot of movies to watch if you haven't seen them. Hopefully you've seen at least the most important ones, but if not, go find them. A lot of them are on Canopy. The Criterion channel is launching very soon. Again, don't just watch the ones that I'm calling thrillers, of course. There are plenty of other movies that are very suspenseful and will probably help you in your writing, whether you're a thriller writer or not. Basic structure of the film thriller, once again, according to me, the protagonist is thrust into a dangerous situation that they either don't understand or, like in an open mystery, fully understand and must convince others of. And I want to go back to the mystery here, because in the mystery, traditionally you've got two major types, which are the open mystery and the closed mystery. The open mystery format, the audience or the reader sees what happens early on, and it's relatively clear. You could argue that Psycho is kind of an open mystery in the sense that we see what happens to Marion in the first act, and the rest of it's piecing it together. That being said, it doesn't make it any less suspenseful to show the audience what is actually going on very early on. And in fact, this was one of Hitchcock's most famous techniques. Those of you who went to film school will remember this being beaten into your head, that if you want suspense, you show a bomb under the dinner table and then go on to show the rest of the scene, people talking about the weather. Giving the audience a glimpse of the danger in advance is a very common suspense technique. But I would argue, again, that suspense is not necessarily the only thing you should be looking at with a thriller. The protagonist or protagonists are going to make attempts to piece together or reveal the truth, which can involve episodes of extreme danger. And this could be perceived danger, or it could be actual danger. And I make that clarification because of the psychological thriller where the protagonist may be mentally ill or an unreliable narrator, and therefore the danger that he or she is experiencing may or may not have a basis in reality, or it might have a loose basis in reality. But the important thing to remember is that the attempts at least appear to the protagonist to be a dangerous endeavor. The either gathering of clues or the interviewing of people, say in a political thriller or spy thriller. And then they're going to either fail or succeed in their effort. The conspiracy is either going to be revealed or not. The mole is going to be discovered or not in the case of a spy thriller. In a horror thriller, then the source of the supernatural phenomenon is going to be uncovered or it's not. In the case of Rosemary's Baby, there's a coven that's revealed at the end. I mean, the protagonist, Rosemary, is trying to figure out why the hell she is going through all of these awful things. Sorry for the spoiler if you haven't seen it. Yes, also the film Hereditary, I won't spoil the ending, but there is an attempt to piece together the supernatural phenomenon. I'm going to get into that in a second. But I think that this constitutes the only kind of formalistic structure of a thriller that I've seen. And my argument to you, if you're sitting there shaking your head and saying this really doesn't hold up, think of all these movies that don't fit this mold that are considered thrillers, such as Wages of Fear, the classic 1953 French thriller about carrying nitroglycerin through the mountains to put out an oil rig fire. You'd say, okay, well, or what about Failsafe? Sidney Lumet. This is a movie about bomber planes on their way to Moscow that can't be recovered. And, how does this fit in? So what I would argue to you is that a film like Failsafe, a film where planes are headed to Moscow and we've lost contact with them, and now the president has to figure out how to get in touch with them before there's a nuclear holocaust. I would argue to you that films like that fall much more on the spectrum of action films and disaster films. Disaster films are traditionally thought of as a subgenre of action. The disaster in the case of Failsafe is losing contact with the planes itself. That is a disaster, and then the question is, how do we deal with it? And if you're saying, well, no, I still don't buy it, look at a film like Armageddon, this is uncontroversially a disaster film. How do we stop the asteroid from hitting the Earth? Even if you disagree that that's a disaster film, it's at the very least an action film. So action films, again, tend to feature a protagonist who is fighting against just inhuman odds against some force, whether it's a villain or a disaster, and must beat the odds, and almost always do. So Failsafe, I think, Wages of Fear, some of these types of films are structurally more like Armageddon or even Speed, which I would argue is not a thriller at all, even though it offers a lot of thrills. So that's my argument. I think it's the only way to sort of desegregate action from thriller, even though there is such a category as action thriller, and I'm not even going to touch that. But I think that if you go and write a film that follows this, or novel that follows this basic structure, a protagonist thrust into a dangerous situation, attempts are made, dangerous episodes occur in those attempts, and they're unveiling either a conspiracy or the source of a supernatural phenomenon, et cetera, or the identity of a murderer, or clearing their own name, as is the case for so many Hitchcock films. I think you will have a film script that will uncontroversially be received of as a thriller. If you simply make a film about somebody who's got to disarm a bomb, I don't think that that makes it a thriller, and I think that a lot of people wouldn't view it that way, depending on how you treated it. And it's not just that it features a spy as a protagonist, because as we discussed, the subject matter takes a backseat to the formal qualities, but or the formal structure, I should say. But again, just disarming the bomb, not a thriller. Finding the bomb and having to interview people who are dangerous, and it's maybe there's a conspiracy that planted the bomb there, or there's some kind of constant surveillance, constant threat of danger. That would make it a thriller, in my view. So I'm going to get to the subgenres of thriller here and continue to make this case to you. With the film noir and neo-noir, which we already discussed to an extent. But again, these films have the structure of spy thrillers a lot of the times, or political thrillers, even though they're about crime. And usually there's something to be discovered, whether it's a criminal conspiracy, police corruption in the case of Touch of Evil, or a question of why is the protagonist even being pursued in the first place? The Long Goodbye, classic Altman, which I think is screening in Los Angeles very soon in 35 millimeter, if you get a chance to see it, it asks this question of who killed Marlowe's wife. 7, who's the killer? What's their motivation? You could also argue that Silence of the Lambs has this structure. Whether or not it's a neo-noir, I'm not sure, but it certainly is detective fiction, and concerns itself chiefly with the question of the truth. So I think for it to be a noir, it needs at least elements of the thriller, and I would argue that almost all of the major film noir films could also be categorized as thrillers. There are some in a gray area. I think maybe Key Largo would be an example of that, because it's probably more structurally related to an action film. But for the most part, again, The Big Sleep and Strangers on a Train, these are thrillers. The spy and political thriller, I put them under the same heading because usually when you look up definitions of spy thrillers, you see films that are often called political thrillers. There's sort of a spectrum of spy and political thrillers. Most spy films have some kind of a political statement to make, not always, of course. But Foreign Correspondent by Hitchcock, Parallax View, All the President's Men, JFK. These are films that deal with political subject matter. It doesn't, I think when we say political thriller, usually there has to be, we're not just talking about a film that's a thriller that has some political elements, like Get Out. It's a film that involves political conspiracies, corruption. Thematically, it often involves actual politicians. You could argue that House of Cards, or at least episodes of House of Cards, fall under this category. Z, as we discussed, unveiling a political assassination. And 3 Days of the Condor, which is very Hitchcockian in the sense that Robert Redford's character doesn't know what the hell is going on, and he's trying to piece it together, only to find a massive political conspiracy. Clear and Present Danger, there is also an underlying massive political conspiracy. And Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, there are political elements to it. Again, a lot of the time the spy films ask this question of who's the good guy and who's the bad guy, especially in the binary context of the Cold War, where the USSR was viewed as an inherently evil empire. So these films were sort of subversive in that sense because they often showed the CIA doing nasty or illegal things, just like the KGB. Nevertheless, the question of the truth and what's the conspiracy and who's corrupt and, all of these questions are asked in both spy films and political thrillers. Both tend to usually make some kind of a political point. At the very least, ask questions about who's the good guy. And that would be true of the Bourne Identity as well. The psychological thriller, this is an important subgenre because it occurs in so many, there's so much discussion online about what it constitutes. And in fact, some of the only academic literature I could even find on thrillers was about psychological thrillers specifically. I'm not sure why that is exactly, but I think it's because it is formally interesting insofar as it tends to have an unreliable narrator, or it deals with fluctuating mental states, can sometimes involve a direct commentary on mental illness, or ask questions about mental illness. Psycho, which I think, speaking of politics, probably politically doesn't hold up anymore, but certainly asks the question of what is the mental state of the people involved in this? What is this mental state of the protagonist? How much of what you're seeing is real? What makes these are questions that the psychological thriller asks. You have. I think one of the best examples of this would be Shutter Island, which, if you haven't seen it, is an absolutely outstanding Scorsese psychological thriller, where the question is really, what is going on? What is the reality? It seems to be a dangerous situation somehow, but we don't know what's truth and what's fiction. Gathering together the truth, or the clues that will lead to the truth, is really important to that film. It's also important to films like Primal Fear and you could also argue Mulholland Drive, although that's a little bit more complicated because I think Mulholland Drive, being an art house movie in some ways, being a David Fincher movie, defies genre expectations. And I think a big part of Mulholland Drive is actually the audience asking what's going on, which may or may not actually qualify it as a thriller in my view. But yeah, analyzing and kind of looking at the psychological states of the characters is, I think, a really inherently exciting mechanism that you can use in your own work. It allows you to explore different perspectives, maybe within the same character. The character might have conflicting, not necessarily split personalities, although there's been plenty of films about that, but internal conflict is a big part of it. They might also have a doppelganger. You think of films like Enemy, etc. So the takeaway here is that the psychological thriller really blurs the truth and makes it very difficult for the protagonist to figure out what's going on, because it's not just a mystery where you have to gather the clues. It's not just a spy thriller where you got to find the mole. It's, am I crazy? Do I even know what's going on? It's a fun genre, and I think if you're a writer, it's a really attractive genre. Let's get to the horror thriller, and the case I'm going to make to you, like the case I've continued to make, and I'm starting to repeat myself, is that a horror film has certain characteristics that tend to the intention of the horror film writer is to scare the audience. I don't think that that's a sufficient. I don't think that if you take that and then add suspense, you have a horror thriller. I think that a horror thriller is actually a thriller that has some of the aesthetic and uh, aesthetic components of a horror film, as well as some formal qualities. But most importantly, it's not just that something supernatural or evil is happening to the characters. There is a question of why. Rosemary's Baby, why? Sixth Sense, what is actually going on? It follows what is actually going on. Trying to get to the bottom of what's going on is an inherently important part of this. So you might say, well, what about A Quiet Place? How does that figure in? Well, A Quiet Place, I would argue, is actually a monster movie, which is a subgenre of disaster, which is a subgenre of action. So I think it's technically an action film. I think that for it to really be a horror thriller, there's got to be something out there, whether it's a coven, which is a pretty common trope, or, and by the way, I'm using trope in an informal way. Literary genre theorists wouldn't use trope that way. Trope actually means something else. What I mean to say is motifs that are consistent throughout the genre, but it has to be a question of what is the origin of the horror? What is the source of evil? Okay. Here's some other some other thriller subgenres. Legal thrillers are, like The Firm, Decline, Michael Clayton are one of them. But one important thing is that the stakes have to be really high for it to qualify as a legal thriller, right? Because it's not simply enough that there is a court case and somebody needs to be proven innocent. There has to be danger to the protagonist or protagonists, actual mortal danger, or the threat of incarceration or having your life ruined. Michael Clayton, the firm is willing to kill. The same in The Firm. The client, there's also this threat of violence. So the stakes have to be really high. I've gone over political thrillers as well, and you'll see that most of them also qualify as spy thrillers. The science fiction thriller is also kind of a tricky territory, but again, I would argue that, sorry for the typo on Blade Runner there, but Blade Runner films, owing to their neo-noir elements, they kind of come out of the detective mystery subgenre. This detective mystery genre. So the science fiction subgenre, anytime you have a detective in space, what you're dealing with essentially is a neo-noir. And that's what we have with Blade Runner, trying to figure out the truth, trying to piece together the clues to figure out the reality. Minority Report. And District 9, you have Vicus, who uncovers MNU's diabolical mistreatment of the aliens and is trying to then unveil it to the public and not only clear his own name, but show just how evil MNU is. In a kind of Hitchcockian way. Although the last act does turn into a bit of an action film, it still has this underlying sort of motivation for Vicus that he's trying to get the truth out. And then we talked a little bit about erotic thrillers already, but who's the murderer? Is there sincere? Is this sexual relationship sincere, or is there an ulterior motive? And there tends to be a noir criminal element to erotic thrillers as well. I should mention one more film before opening that up for questions, which is Night of the Hunter, which is one I actually neglected to bring up earlier. But Night of the Hunter is a absolutely seminal film released in 1955 by Charles Laughton about a minister turned serial killer. It was panned in its day, viewed as an absolute disaster, but it's a huge influence on contemporary filmmakers. And if you're a Fincher fan, or if you're a Hitchcock fan, you absolutely have to see this film. I know a lot of people for whom it's their favorite film, and it absolutely has all of the elements of a thriller that we've discussed here, right down to the serial killer that shows up again and again in Silence of the Lambs and Seven and so forth. So just wanted to make sure I mentioned that film so you can put it on your list. But that is kind of a brief overview, a lightning fast overview of a very contentious genre. I hope that you all may have learned something, or at least are now going to go and watch some of these movies. I'll go back to the history here of the literary genealogy. Yeah, I'll open it up to questions at this point, and feel free to ask about anything that was in here. I have to say that I'm not an expert on 19th century fiction, so if you have questions about specific short stories or pulp novels from that area, from that era, I'm probably not going to be too much of a help. But again, just to reiterate, I really believe that the thriller genre emerged out of the mystery with some adventure and Gothic elements, and in film sort of emerged out of a combination of expressionist cinema, film noir, and with literary antecedents in hard-boiled fiction and early spy fiction, such as The Riddle of the Sands, the novel I mentioned earlier. So with that, I will open it up to questions and comments, and also if you think I'm totally off base here, don't know what I'm talking about, please feel free to challenge me here. But please go ahead.
Awesome. There looks like there's a couple questions in here in the Q&A box already.
Okay.
They look pretty good. Do you want me to read them, or you got it?
Yeah, I can read them. So curious about the horror thriller. Would a movie like Scream then, or Happy Death Day qualify as horror thriller, as a major element of those films is the mystery of who's behind the mask? I would personally argue that yes, they would. I think that if a fundamental motivating dramatic need, to borrow from Sid Field, if the dramatic need is to unveil the killer, then I think at the very least you have to say that it's got a thriller element. But I do think that you could say that these films are indeed thrillers, at least as far as I'm concerned. And again, this all gets very squishy, and I've tried here to create some kind of a formal working definition that's more satisfying than just something that's suspenseful, because I think that that's a useless categorization that really doesn't help, certainly doesn't help writers, but it also doesn't help viewers. So yeah, I think a lot of these sorts of serial killer movies or killer movies, I think tend to be thrillers because of this question of who's doing it. If it's just some kind of inscrutable force that's out there and you're trying to get away from it, then that's more of a monster movie, in my view, and therefore more of an action film or a disaster film, disaster action. It's on the disaster action axis, right? So if it's just an escape, just trying to get away, I don't think that's enough. I think there's got to be this question of what is the reality of the situation. Escape films, The Revenant, yeah, escape movies, again, so The Revenant, yeah, it's a hybridized movie. Let me think about this for a second, because I don't think it does. I don't think it works, because I don't think it's this fundamental question of what is the truth. I mean, if you're just trying to, I mean, it's more of a revenge story. So I think it falls more squarely into the Western, actually, in that respect. But I mean, a case could be made that it's got thriller elements. I'm not sure. I don't think so. I think it has. I think to make The Revenant a thriller, it would have to be sort of more of a whodunit of why have I been left for dead and what's the reason behind it, not just you left me for dead, now I'm coming for you, which is more of a Western in my view. So I hope that helps. With movies like Get Out, okay, another question. This was really interesting. Thank you. with movies like Get Out, this genre really shows limitless opportunities in storytelling. I think it does, and I think this is definitely not a formal categorization, but it is interesting to me that a lot of thrillers have political content, and especially as I discussed the spy thriller, but legal thrillers as well. Usually, there's some kind of, there's some kind of social commentary. A lot of the time, it involves corporate corruption, corporate greed, The Constant Gardener, these types of movies. But Get Out is interesting because it does add that horror element into it. But there is the question in Get Out of why is this going on, which I think really does make it a thriller. And without spoiling it for those of you who haven't seen it, it really is kind of a classic thriller in that respect. I think it has kind of spawned its own subgenre that I didn't get a chance to talk about because it's so fresh and so new. But there's been a lot of movies that have come out in the last few years. I think there was one of Ken, a French film that is sort of in this social thriller genre. I'm really excited to see where it goes. Yeah, get out there. I think it's a really great time to be writing these types of movies, and whether it's shorts or even short fiction. I'm currently working on a feature myself that I originally thought was a thriller before doing the research for this webinar, and only to discover for myself that it does have social content, but it's not actually a thriller because it doesn't involve the search for any kind of underlying truth. It is just simply an escape. It's an escape film or a road film. Road films are kind of related to that. But yeah, I think you do have to ask this question if you're going to do a social thriller. It's not enough to just, there's this right-wing white supremacists are coming for this character and they got to run away. I don't think that's a thriller. I don't think that's a social thriller in the Get Out sort of mold. I think there's got to be this Hitchcockian element of a bigger question. So hopefully that will inspire some people to get out there and start writing. Okay, Arman, very succinct breakdown. Thank you so much. In your estimation, what is the best, greatest twist in the thriller genre? What set it on its ear and of course works? Ooh, man, these are the types of questions that I have trouble answering because greatest is a really tough word for me. I can go with favorite twist. I'd say my favorite twist is actually the twist that comes at the end of, in a thriller, is the end of 3 Days of the Condor, because I can't give it away, but it's a political twist that completely holds up today. It's almost a post 9/11 twist, and it's so prescient, and also just in terms of the screenwriting, it's amazing because you just don't see it coming. So forgetting the political element of it, but it just works in every single conceivable way for me. And every time I watch it, and I've seen it so many times, it's always, every time you're just waiting for it to drop. And especially if you're watching it with somebody who hasn't seen it before, it's like, there we go. End of the movie, lights out. I got to say Third Man, it's a cliche answer, but Third Man is also you have to put it up there. God, there's so many really good twists, right? I think I'd have to go with those two. I don't know. I'd be interested to hear from you all too about what your favorite twists are in the comments there. But yeah, 3 Days of the Condor. Okay, I think yeah, I think those are the only open questions.
Yeah. We'll give people a second if there's any straggler questions. This was awesome. Very thorough.
Thank you. Yeah. Again, it's such a controversial genre and a complicated genre, and there's so many genres that it kind of dovetails with. But I do think that I do think it warrants its own classification, and I think that, and I hope that that people will start to think about it as its own proper genre, even academically and critically as well, because I think it deserves it and it has its own lineage and so forth. So,
I mean, it's cool. Maybe one last question. It looks like, and then we'll call it. Oh, there's 2 more questions.
oh,
Up
cool.
to you. Cool.
Nice. Is it a bad idea to write a thriller that the audience has choices in the end, meaning you don't answer the plot? Yeah, that's fine. I think a lot of psychological thrillers don't do that. There's like this question of what happened, and I don't want to give away. I talked about one of them. I don't want to give away the ending of one of them, but psychological thrillers a lot of the time, because of this unreliable narrator quality, you kind of don't really know, did that actually happen or not? And I think that's fine. And I think it can kind of be satisfying in its own way. That's a really interesting question from a screenwriting perspective. You know, and it goes back to always goes back to these questions of ambiguity versus clarity. An ambiguous ending versus a totally unclear and confusing ending. It can go either way. That's always a tricky territory. But I think the important thing is the search for the truth, the search for some underlying truth, whether it's a conspiracy or an identity of somebody, or what actually happened in the murder. You know, if that's the question that's being asked, you don't have to answer it necessarily. But as a screenwriter, I also have to say that when you do that, you're entering dangerous territory, because you have to give the audience something, I think, to give it some kind of a conclusion. And yeah, I think Shutter Island does that really well. But I won't say anything else about Shutter Island, because if you haven't seen it, I'm going to totally spoil it. Probably already answered. Where do you think thrillers are going? Okay, where do I think thrillers are going? Well, I mean, I think there's right now, in the kind of the wake of the 2016 election, I think it's all politics right now. I think social political thrillers are really hot in a way that they haven't been, gosh, I mean, probably ever. I mean, again, it's social thriller is being categorized as a new genre by some. Jordan Peele views it as part of a lineage, and Peele has mentioned other movies where I'm like, I don't really know if that's the same thing as Get Out or even related, but hey, you know, he's the filmmaker. But I do think that I think kind of sort of some of these economic questions that we have, there's a lot of conspiracy theories out there. You know, I think some of these conspiracy theories, you know, you look at what's going on with the entire Epstein conspiracy, if you're familiar with that. I bet there's going to be a thriller about that. You know, there's a lot of weird political, social stuff happening right now, and the rise of the far right and all these things. I think there's going to be a lot of movies about that stuff. Yeah. Is The Matrix a thriller? That's a tough question. Oh, man. If I think about it, I think it is. I think it is a thriller, and I think it's a thriller. No, actually, now that I've said it out loud, it absolutely is a thriller, because, you know, just like in a psychological thriller where it's a question of what is the actual reality, the Matrix asks that quite literally. Like, what is what reality is real? What am I looking at? You know, it turns out that, well, I guess most of you have probably seen The Matrix, so I think I can spoil it. But it turns out that the reality that we live in isn't real. That's the sort of the denouement, and you know, at least the first part of the film is, you know, asking that question. I didn't get into this structurally, but I do think that, you know, a lot of the time in films that I would consider thrillers, the third act, or even the latter part of the second act, maybe, you know, the question has sort of been answered, and now we're into more of an action territory, or a chase, an escape. And I think that is, you know, that's just a tendency of the genre. So I think The Matrix sort of falls into that category. Inception. Somebody just asked, is Inception also a thriller? You know, it's been a while since I've seen Inception, so I have to look at the script again. But I believe that I believe that Inception kind of gives away too much about the mechanics of the universe, for it to have that kind of Matrix-like thriller quality. I think it's a little bit more on the action spectrum, but I'd be open to a different take on that. Okay, in a thriller, do the characters get spooked or find out the reality is the same as a viewer? Like, don't leave too many clues for the audience that the characters do not know. Well, I mean, they certainly can get spooked. And yeah, I mean, yeah, sure. I mean, there's any millions of ways of doing it, just like there's millions of sort of whodunit mysteries and Agatha Christie type stories. How much do you want to reveal? Is it an open mystery or not? As I talked about earlier, you can give away the whole conspiracy or the whole reality in the first 5 minutes. Now, if you're a clever writer, you might be able to do it in a way that still, you know, it leaves things a little unclear for the audience or keeps them at the edge of their seat. But you certainly can, you know, answer questions at the same pace that the characters are learning the truth. You can, and Hitchcock sort of would keep the audience right with the characters, you know, a lot of the time. Or the writer can be way ahead of the curve, and then you've got a lot of twists that come out of nowhere, you know. And I guess Hitchcock did that as well. So, you know, it's kind of dependent on what you want to accomplish, and it's a little bit stylistic. I mean, I think there's no right way to do it, as long as the character is, as long as the gathering of information, the gathering of clues is an inherently dangerous endeavor. And that is where the suspense comes from, you know, where the audience is at. I think the more ahead of the curve the audience is, the harder it is to generate suspense in some ways. Although, on the contrary, if you know that the guy sitting across from your protagonist is, you know, a spy or a gangster with a gun under the table, and the protagonist doesn't, and this scene is, you know, 15 minutes long or whatever, maybe that's really, really suspenseful. So it's kind of a taster's choice, as my old writing professor at USC used to say.
All right. I think that's it. Looks like that's it.
Okay. Very cool. Well, we're on time here.
Yeah, this was really, really thorough and really great. Thank you so much.
Cool. Thanks.
Okay. Have a great rest of your Sunday, everybody.
Hey, you too. Go watch some thrillers. Bye.
Yeah. Bye.